As a man who has dedicated your professional life to the study of history, what do you believe to be the importance of learning about the past, as there is increasingly an emphasis on STEM fields with students feeling the pressure to study those disciplines?
Well, I have nothing against STEM fields, but I do think that the humanities in general and history in particular are very important subjects for young people to become familiar with. In a democracy as we have, to me, to be an informed citizen, to think about creatively the problems that face our society, you need to know about our history. History doesn't tell us exactly what ought to be done. If you study the history of immigration, it doesn't tell you exactly what immigration policy ought to be today, which is very controversial, but it gives you an insight into how we got to where we are and what various kinds of policies have been attempted or implemented in the past. And a society without a knowledge of history is like a person with amnesia. You can function perfectly well day to day with amnesia, but you have no sense of where you've been, how you've gotten to where you are. And I think that's a big problem. And I think our society doesn't know enough about its own history, and the more young people study history, the better they'll be as citizens of our democracy in the future.
All right. This past summer, there was an impassioned debate and protests actually broke out about the Confederate flag on many Capitol buildings, including those of Mississippi and South Carolina. Do you believe the flag controversy to be an example of rewriting or ignoring the past?
Well, I can understand why many people find the flying of the Confederate flag offensive. The Confederacy was a political system dedicated to the preservation of slavery. That's what it was. As Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, said, slavery is the cornerstone of the Confederacy. What many people forget is that the flying of the Confederate flag is a relatively recent thing. Those flags were put up mostly in the 1950s and 60s, not right after the Civil War. They were put up as a kind of in-your-face insult to the civil rights movement, to reaffirm white supremacy and segregation in these places. So one should not think that this is heritage from time immemorial. But regardless of how they got there, I think if we want this to be an inclusive society, a society where everybody feels comfortable, symbols like that, which really I think are offensive to many people, ought to be retired. They should be put into a museum to reflect the history of the Confederacy. But to fly them on public buildings or public sites like they used to in South Carolina, they took it down at the South Carolina State House, or to have it as part of the official state flag of Mississippi, as it still is a statement by the government of that state about who is important and who isn't important. And I think that's to be deplored.
Mm-hmm. At your lecture, you were asked if your own beliefs have shaped your writing and your research, to which you explained the importance of having an opinion while at the same time keeping an open mind. You reference how some historians place figures on pedestals and they choose to ignore the facts that might challenge a historical figure's noble status. How do you think we should balance the contributions of these historical figures, but at the same time acknowledging that they have faults?
Well, there isn't a human being in the world who doesn't have some faults or isn't imperfect in some regard, and that's not an insult to them. Obviously, people like to read about great figures in our history, whether it's Lincoln or George Washington or others. There's nothing wrong with that, but I think from far too long, history was mostly written from the point of view of quote-unquote great men, and the contributions and actions of ordinary Americans of all kinds, white, black, Native American, other kinds, were pretty much ignored. Today, that's a much bigger part of the study of history than it has been. I don't think the job of the historian is either to celebrate or to deprecate past leaders of society. It's just to understand them. And most of them are contradictory figures who have strengths and weaknesses. And, looking back from the perspective of 150 years to Lincoln or 200 years to Jefferson or something like that, you can weigh their contributions and their flaws much more, in a much more balanced way than may have been possible at the time. So I don't see there's any problem with, I think trying to glorify somebody and make them into a kind of a larger-than-life iconic figure is always going to distort history, and I think that's something to be avoided.
You've written extensively about the Reconstruction era and its importance. Why do you think it remains a chapter in our country's history that most people don't know about, or they're not very aware of the details of?
Well, partly because it's overshadowed by the Civil War. The Civil War generates a tremendous amount of interest among Americans. Everybody's heard of the Civil War, even if they may not know a lot about it. Also, Reconstruction doesn't have a very satisfying ending. William Dean Howells, the novelist, once said that Americans like a tragedy with a happy ending. But the Reconstruction doesn't have a happy ending. It's not easy to fit into a narrative of American history of the expansion of democracy, the expansion of freedom, because in Reconstruction you had a great expansion of democracy and then a return and a retrenchment and a retreat from that same democracy. So, you know, there are many reasons, but it's just an uncomfortable period for people to deal with. It doesn't show us, to me, it shows tremendous aspiration and progress and then a reversal, but the reversal doesn't show our society in the most flattering light. And I think that is why many people sort of tend to avoid it.
Mm-hmm. And then just lastly, are there any other projects that you're currently working on, maybe aside from Reconstruction or any?
I'm not. I published a book in the earlier this year about the Underground Railroad. That's what I lectured about here yesterday. I don't have another project right on my agenda right now. I'm waiting around to think about that. But after writing a book, you generally try to take a little time off, and because it is very time-consuming and demanding, and it's very exhilarating too when you get finished. But therefore, you want to sort of rest on your laurels for a little bit.
All right, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, nice to talk to you.